In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Fast forward almost 6 decades later, and the fight for economic equality marches on. As working-class Americans struggle to earn a living wage, secure safe housing, and get an affordable education, Congress is still mulling over the Human Infrastructure Bill, which is supposed to close the gap. Congress is currently debating the passage of the bill, and civil rights leader Reverend Dr. William Barber is hard at work ensuring that legislation passes. From his early days as the president of the NAACP Youth Council at the age of 15 to his current work as the head of the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber has spent his life organizing and fighting to ensure every American is given the dignity of work. Over the last summer, he led the Poor People's Campaign on what he called a season of nonviolent, direct action to save our democracy. And joining me tonight to discuss this and all the things in the Human Infrastructure Bill is Reverend Dr. William Barber. So glad to have you. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much, Aisha, and be it the Black News Network for having me on, and Amplified. Thank you for being on Amplified.
You know, I first want you to just give us a very quick update on the march that took place this summer. I know that you have been marching hard for voting rights, and you talk so much about poverty, and I'm going to get into the human infrastructure piece, but just tell everybody what was happening this summer.
Well, the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, we have 47 state coordinating committees, 300 partners, 2,500 members of our prophetic social justice council, made up of Black, white, brown, Native, and indigenous people. And we said there needed to be a season of nonviolent civil disobedience. So from D.C. to Texas to West Virginia, people stood up, hundreds of people were arrested. And what we were arguing is that you can't separate these issues from voting rights to the economic justice. They all have to be held together. And that we cannot do one without the other. If we're going to change America, we got to address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And we put out a plan to do that called 14 Points for the Healing of the Nation.
Oh, we got a lot to heal from and through, and I love that you have brought economic justice to the forefront in a way that we don't always make that connection, like you said, with civil rights, with voting rights, etc. And now that we've got in front of us what to me seems at least to be this human infrastructure bill that feels like it might be the biggest economic stimulus, if you will, to address poverty and so many other issues that families are facing and that poor people are facing. I wonder what your take is on that.
Well, we said to the President's Economic Council back when, just before he got inaugurated, that we had to go big. The EPI, Economic Policy Institute, actually says you need about $10 trillion to deal with the issue of poverty and low wealth in this country, because before COVID, there were 140 million people living in poverty and low wealth, 43% of this nation. 8 million more went into poverty during COVID, and 60% of Black people were poor and low wealth before COVID. So part of what we have to do is look at the depth of the problem. We have 32 million people in this country who have make less than a living wage, less than $15 an hour. If they did, they would pump $300 billion into the economy, and 40% of Black people would be lifted out of poverty and low wealth almost immediately. And one other thing, you should know that we spend $1 trillion a year because of child poverty, and several $1 trillion a year from the loss of wages because of the difference between what women and men make. So the problem is huge. Now, this Build Back Better plan is a step. I want to be clear about that. It's a step. It is not the completion of the journey. It's talking about $300 billion once a year for 10 years. So it's a step, and it's a compromise down from what economists know we actually need to change this society and to actually help the very people, poor and low wealth people, who saved us during COVID, because it was poor and low wealth people that had to go to work. They were essential workers. They got infected first. They got sick first. They died first. They were called essential, but now they're treated like they're expendable. So yes, we support the step, but it is a step. It is not the complete package.
You're working with Congresswomen Barber Lee and Pramila Jayapal in crafting what you call the third Reconstruction. Tell us a little bit about that. What is the third Reconstruction?
Well, in America, we had a first Reconstruction in the 1800s after slavery. Black and white people got together, poor whites and blacks and freedmen, and said, here are the things we have to do. We need a 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, we need fundamental structural change. Then there was a second Reconstruction civil rights movement that said structural change, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. Well, we never completed those Reconstructions. They were either killed, assassinated, or just stopped. We need a third Reconstruction that takes these 5 issues and really puts together an omnibus kind of piece of legislation. And what we've presented is 12 things. We have to change how we measure poverty. Because most people 2 years ago were saying we only had 39 million poor and low-wealth people. When you look at the actual numbers, based on a thing called a supplemental measurement, it's 140 million. That's almost half of the country. We have to
I was just going to ask you to describe that. The measurement of poverty, because I'm listening to the numbers that you're sharing, and it's interesting to me because they're not exactly the numbers that I've seen. So tell us about how you're calculating that in this third Reconstruction plan.
Right. Well, one of the things that the third Reconstruction building is ending poverty from the bottom up. It begins with the premise that poverty is a policy choice, not people's personal failure. That's number one. And that you got to do living wages and housing and education and immigration reform and voting rights protections to all deal with the issues of poverty and the interlocking injustices. But the government created a measure in the 60s on poverty. And if you use that measure today, Aisha, it actually says if you make about $12,900 a year, you're not poor. Well, that's utterly ridiculous.
That's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous.
Economists at places like Columbia and Harvard and other places said, no, let's look at the supplemental income. Let's look at the number of people that would be in full poverty if it wasn't for supplements, what the government does. That number is 140 million. And the number of people who make less than $15 an hour, which is a basic living wage, is 32 million people. And when you disaggregate the black folk, that's 40% of black people. 40%, that if you raise the living wage to 40% of black people would be raised out of poverty and low wealth immediately. So when a mansion and a cinema block living wages, we should be calling that a race issue too. We shouldn't just say voting rights is a race issue. In fact, voting rights is not just a race issue. It's not just Jim Crow. Because these laws they're passing today, they're going to hurt black people, white people, brown people, women, children, students, and all. But Dr. King said you have to understand suppressing the vote has always been connected to those who want to suppress the possibility of poor and low wealth people of every race coming together to change the economic structures of our nation.
Wow, Reverend Dr. Barber, let's hope that this infrastructure that you talk about. Thank you so much for your work and for joining us on Amplify tonight to share about it. We hope to have you back.